All right, let's dive into the world of Jean-Paul Sartre.
Sounds good.
You know, looking at the stuff you send over, it's a really interesting mix.
Yeah.
There's biographical stuff, some pretty deep philosophical dives, even analysis of his political views.
Right.
It's clear you want to go beyond just knowing, like, who Sartre was.
There's
You
some-
want those aha moments about his ideas, and if they still matter today.
Absolutely.
I think to really get Sartre, we've got to get the world that shaped him, right?
Yeah. His life and work, they're so intertwined with all those huge events of the 20th century.
So, okay, let's start with his death in 1980.
Okay.
The sources mention this massive turnout at his funeral, over 30,000 people.
Wow.
Even the French president, who, wasn't exactly on board with Sartre's politics, he paid tribute.
It's pretty incredible. And it wasn't just the French who saw how important he was.
Oh, yeah.
Jorge Amado, the Brazilian novelist, he was a member of the Communist Party, actually.
Right.
He called Sartre the most important man since the war.
It's pretty remarkable to think someone with, potentially opposing views would have that level of respect.
It speaks volumes, doesn't it?
The sources also mention Gilles Deleuze,
Okay.
another philosopher who considered Sartre, get this, his teacher,
Interesting.
and praised him for bringing something new to philosophy after the war.
Mm-hmm.
I'm starting to think we're dealing with a real heavyweight here, but to really get his ideas, we need that historical context.
Exactly. And there are three key elements we need to consider.
Okay, lay it on me.
The state of philosophy after Nietzsche, the impact of World War I, and then the allure of the Russian Revolution.
So those are like the pillars that Sartre's journey is built on.
Precisely.
All right, let's start with Nietzsche.
Right.
The sources mention Sartre was drawn to his ideas initially, but also felt like his philosophy had created like a crisis.
Well, Nietzsche had this really radical way of questioning everything.
Like what?
Traditional values, beliefs. He challenged morality, religion, even reason itself.
It's like he was tearing down walls.
Exactly. He deconstructed those systems, exposed their flaws, and famously declared the death of God.
This resonated with Sartre, right?
It did, but it also left this void.
Like, if everything we thought we knew was suddenly up for grabs,
Yeah.
what was left to build upon?
That's a great way to put it.
It's like Nietzsche tore down the old philosophical house, but didn't leave a blueprint for a new one.
A perfect analogy.
And this was happening alongside a growing rejection of Hegelian thinking, right?
Yes, thinkers like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, they were pushing back against the Hegelian and Marxist focus on dialectics.
Dialectics. So that...
That idea of history unfolding through this series of conflicts and resolution.
Okay, and they were searching for new ways to understand the individual and their existence.
Right.
This makes me think of those choose-your-own-adventure books we had as kids.
Oh, I love those.
Instead of following that predetermined path, you could make choices that led to different outcomes. Is that kind of what these philosophers were doing? Rejecting that fixed historical narrative?
That's a fantastic analogy. They were rebelling against those grand narratives, trying to find meaning in the individual's experience.
And that's where Husserl and phenomenology come in.
You got it.
The sources mention that Sartre saw phenomenology as a way to address those problems Nietzsche had raised.
Exactly. Phenomenology offered a method for grounding philosophy in the lived experience of the individual.
So instead of starting with abstract theories,
Right.
it was about understanding the world as we actually experience it.
Yes, imagine trying to describe the color red to someone who's never seen it.
Okay.
You can't just define it. You have to evoke that experience of redness.
So that's what phenomenology tries to do with all of our experiences.
Exactly.
But before we get too deep into that, we need to talk about World War I.
That feels like a heavy shift.
It is, and it was for Sartre, too.
Yeah.
Even though he didn't fight in the war directly, its brutality really left a mark on him.
Think about the sheer scale of death, the new technologies,
Yeah.
like submarines and poison gas.
Making it so horrific, yeah, the sources mention the battles of Verdun and the Somme,
Right.
where hundreds of thousands were killed. It's hard to fathom the impact of that kind of destruction.
It's almost impossible.
His family had roots in Alsace.
A region heavily impacted by the war, and it contributed to Sartre's pessimism about human nature and progress.
It's like he saw the potential for barbarity lurking beneath the surface of civilization.
Absolutely.
And this disillusionment wasn't limited to philosophy, was it?
No, not at all.
The art movements that emerged after the war, Dadaism and Surrealism, they reflected that sense of a world gone mad, like a scream of defiance against the old ways of thinking.
Precisely.
And it's in this context that we can understand Sartre's, his famous declaration of hatred for the bourgeoisie, who he blamed for the war and its devastation. It's a raw expression of anger and disillusionment.
It really is.
So we've got this backdrop of philosophical upheaval, the trauma of war, and then comes the Russian Revolution.
Exactly.
This was huge for Sartre and his generation.
Absolutely. The revolution sparked widespread interest in Marxist philosophy because it represented the possibility of radical change.
Like a way to create a more just and equitable world.
Exactly.
The sources mention Simone de Beauvoir, Sartre's lifelong partner, a brilliant philosopher herself.
Of course.
Wrote in her memoirs that Sartre was tempted to join the Communist Party. And it's important to note that he wasn't just passively absorbing these ideas.
Oh, no.
He was engaged in these debates about the revolution.
Yes.
Questioning the role of individual choice versus material conditions, the dynamics between the Communist Party and the masses.
Right. He was wrestling with those big questions about freedom and determinism, individual agency, and historical forces.
So how did he approach those questions? What was he trying to figure out?
Well, one of his key concerns was the role of the individual in a revolutionary movement.
Okay.
Was it simply about economic forces shaping history? Or could individuals truly make a difference? And then he was grappling with that relationship between the Communist Party and the proletariat.
Right, like, should the party lead the masses according to a fixed plan, as Lenin argued?
Exactly.
Or should it be more responsive to the spontaneous actions of the people?
It's a fundamental question.
This is getting to the heart of Sartre's philosophy, isn't it? This tension between individual freedom and collective action.
It is.
Between shaping your own destiny and working towards a shared goal.
Absolutely.
But it's not just abstract ideas. Right? The sources also talk about how Sartre's personal life, his childhood, deeply influenced his work.
Yeah, his autobiography, The Words, he delves into those early experiences. He talks about the absence of the father, seeing that traditional father figure as a symbol of societal constraints.
Constraints that limit individual freedom.
Precisely. And in fact, he famously said, "No father is good. Let us not complain of men, but of the bond of fatherhood, which is rotten."
It's a provocative statement, but it reflects his upbringing with a strong, independent mother.
Right, where that traditional paternal authority was absent.
So would you say his philosophy is a kind of rebellion against those traditional structures of authority?
There's definitely an element of that.
But it's more nuanced than simple rebellion.
It is. He's exploring the very nature of freedom and responsibility, how they emerge in the face of those constraints.
The sources also mention an incident where Sartre's grandfather was disappointed with his appearance after a haircut, making him feel like a toad. This seems like a surprisingly personal detail for these philosophical discussions.
It might seem trivial.
Yeah.
But for Sartre, it was a pivotal experience. It made him acutely aware of his physicality, his ugliness. It contributed to his philosophical emphasis on the uniqueness of each individual.
Okay.
He was grappling with the idea that we're all fundamentally different, that there's no one else quite like us.
It's like that experience awakened him to the reality of his own embodied existence, his difference from others.
Exactly.
And then, of course, there's Simone de Beauvoir. She was more than just his partner.
Yeah.
She was a pioneering feminist, brilliant philosopher in her own right.
Absolutely. Her groundbreaking work, The Second Sex, it explored how cultural forces shaped women's identities.
Right. Arguing that woman is not born, but rather becomes.
Precisely. Her influence on Sartre's thinking, especially on his understanding of gender roles and social constructs, it's immense.
It's hard to imagine his work without her presence and their constant back and forth.
It's impossible.
So we've got this complex web of influences.
Yes.
Personal experiences, historical events, these philosophical debates, all shaping Sartre's journey.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And he's engaging with some of the giants of philosophy, like Husserl and Heidegger.
Yes, crucial figures in his development.
In fact, Simone de Beauvoir describes this moment when Sartre first learned about Husserl's phenomenology.
Oh, right.
From their friend Raymond Aron. He was so excited, so energized by the idea that he apparently turned pale with emotion.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
What was it about phenomenology that had such a strong impact on him?
Well, remember, phenomenology is about understanding the world as it appears to our consciousness.
Right.
focusing on the lived experience of the individual.
Okay.
Initially, Sartre embraced this wholeheartedly.
Right.
But as he developed his own ideas, he began to critique certain aspects of Husserl's philosophy,
Okay. Like what?
particularly the concept of the transcendental ego.
This idea of a core, unchanging self that exists prior to experience.
Okay.
I'm starting to see how this connects to his emphasis on freedom.
Yes,
If there's no predetermined self, then we are free to create ourselves through our choices and actions.
exactly.
And then there's Heidegger, whose philosophy, especially his book, Being in Time, had a profound impact on Sartre's early work.
Yes, a major influence.
So what did Sartre find so compelling about Heidegger?
Heidegger explored those themes of anxiety, finitude, and the meaning of being.
Okay.
He emphasized that we are thrown into existence without a predetermined purpose, constantly facing the possibility of non-existence.
These ideas resonated deeply with Sartre and fueled his own exploration of existential themes.
They did.
It sounds like pretty heavy stuff, but the relationship wasn't without its complications.
No, it wasn't.
The sources mention that Sartre eventually distanced himself from Heidegger,
Right.
especially after Heidegger's involvement with the Nazi Party came to light.
It was a difficult realization for Sartre. Seeing a philosopher he admired align himself with such a horrific ideology.
Yeah.
It forced him to confront the ethical implications of these ideas.
And it ultimately pushed him to forge his own distinct path.
Absolutely.
This reminds me of something we see with a lot of great thinkers.
What's that?
They're influenced by their predecessors, but they also have to break free from those influences to develop their own unique voice.
Yes.
And sometimes that process involves these difficult choices, even betrayals.
That's true.
Speaking of choices and betrayals, the sources highlight two dangerous friendships that were crucial to Sartre's development.
Oh, yeah.
His relationships with Paul Nizan and Maurice Merleau-Ponty.
Right. These friendships weren't just personal. They deeply shaped his intellectual and political trajectory.
I'm getting the sense that dangerous doesn't necessarily mean negative in this context.
No, not at all.
It's more about the way these relationships pushed Sartre to confront those tough questions.
And make those tough choices.
You're absolutely right. These friendships were intellectually stimulating,
Yeah.
but they also led to conflict and even heartbreak.
They did it.
Let's start with Paul Nizan.
Okay.
He was a close friend who constantly challenged Sartre to be more politically engaged.
Right. Nizan famously wrote, "It is time to say simply that there is a philosophy of the oppressors and a philosophy of the oppressed."
Calling for intellectuals to take sides, to fight against injustice.
Exactly. This call to action really resonated with Sartre.
So Nizan was like that activist friend who pushed Sartre to move beyond theory to engage with the real world.
Exactly.
And tragically, Nizan was killed during World War II after leaving the Communist Party because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
It was a devastating loss for Sartre, both personally and intellectually.
It's fascinating to see how personal relationships can intertwine with those philosophical and political commitments.
Yeah, it's all connected.
So how about Merleau-Ponty? What was his influence on Sartre?
Well, Merleau-Ponty was a brilliant philosopher in his own right.
Right.
And he played a key role in guiding Sartre's early understanding of Marxism.
Okay.
His book, Humanism and Terror, explored those complexities of revolutionary violence.
Arguing that it could be a necessary tool for liberation,
Yes.
but also acknowledging its ethical dilemmas.
Right. A timeless question.
Seems particularly relevant today as we grapple with the role of violence in social change movements.
Absolutely.
It's a question that Sartre and Merleau-Ponty debated intensely.
They did.
However, their friendship eventually fractured
Yeah.
due to their differing views on the role of intellectuals in political action.
Sartre embraced that passionate engagement, often putting himself on the front lines.
While Merleau-Ponty advocated for a more cautious, analytical approach.
Right. A classic conflict between the activist and the scholar.
Both valuable perspectives, but often difficult to reconcile.
Yes, it's a tough balance.
And it's within this complex web of relationships, commitments, and influences that Sartre's own unique exploration of existentialism emerges.
Exactly.
Now we're getting to the good stuff.
Right.
The angst, the freedom, the responsibility, the sources mention two of his literary works that really capture these themes, Nausea and No Exit.
Great choices.
Nausea is a great place to start because it throws you right into the depths of existential experience.
It does.
The protagonist, Roquentin, he has this sudden, overwhelming realization of existence that leads to anxiety and alienation.
Right.
He's confronted with what Sartre calls contingency, the idea that existence is not necessary, it's fundamentally absurd. Okay, but what does that actually mean? What does it feel like to experience contingency?
Imagine walking down the street and suddenly you're intensely aware of your body, your senses, the sheer fact that you exist.
Okay.
And it hits you. There's no reason why you should exist. You simply are.
And that realization can be terrifying because it undermines everything we think we know about meaning and purpose.
It can be deeply unsettling.
It's like the ground beneath your feet suddenly disappears and you're left floating in a void.
A perfect analogy.
And Sartre calls this feeling nausea.
All right.
It's not just physical discomfort, is it? It's this profound sense of unease.
Disorientation.
In the face of existence.
So
it's not a very pleasant experience.
It can be quite disturbing.
But Sartre also sees it as a starting point for freedom.
He does.
If there's no inherent meaning, no purpose,
then we're free to create our own.
So it's not just despair, it's about the possibility of self-creation.
Exactly.
And how does No Exit fit into this?
Well, No Exit is a play that famously explores the idea that hell is other people.
I've always loved that title.
It's a powerful one.
3 characters find themselves trapped in a room together for eternity.
Yes.
And their interactions reveal how the gaze of others can limit our freedom, make us objects.
Exact.
And of course, there's that famous line.
Which one?
The executioner is each one for the other 2.
Ah, yes. That perfectly captures the potential for conflict in human relationships.
We can become each other's tormentors, using our judgments and expectations to trap each other.
In roles we don't want to play, but there's another side to it as well.
Oh.
The play highlights how our identities are formed in relation to others.
Okay.
We can't escape the influence of the other, but we can choose how we respond. We can strive to see each other as subjects, not just objects.
And create relationships based on mutual recognition and respect.
Exactly.
So even though it's about hell, it's also about that potential for human connection.
Yeah.
Even in the most absurd situations.
Absolutely.
But to really understand these ideas, we need to delve into Sartre's big one, being and nothingness. Right.
Absolutely. That's where he lays out his existentialist philosophy in all its complexity.
All right, ready to dive in. What are the key takeaways from being and nothingness that'll help us understand Sartre's vision?
Well, he elaborates on the distinction between 2 fundamental modes of being in itself and being for itself.
Okay, break that down for me.
Being in itself is the realm of objects.
Like what?
A rock, a tree, a table.
Okay.
They simply exist. They have no consciousness, no freedom, no choice. It's just there.
So being itself is like the default setting of existence, the way things just are.
Exactly.
But then there's being for itself.
Right. This is the realm of consciousness of you and me.
So as conscious beings, we're not just there.
No. We're aware of our existence and we have the capacity to make choices.
Choices that shape our reality.
Precisely.
So being for itself is like an upgrade, a more dynamic way of existing.
I like that. It's not just about being aware. It's about constantly making choices that define who we are.
What we value. And how we engage with the world.
Exactly. That freedom is at the core of Sartre's existentialism. And it's both exhilarating and terrifying.
It makes me think of standing at a crossroads with all these paths stretching out before me. It's exciting to know I can choose my direction, but it's also a bit daunting to realize there's no map, no predetermined route.
A great analogy, and it highlights another key concept from being and nothingness. The look.
The look. That sounds a bit ominous.
It can.
What's it all about?
Think about a time when you felt someone's gaze on you and you suddenly became self-conscious.
Okay, yeah.
Aware of yourself as an object being observed, that's what Sartre means by the look.
It's how the gaze of another person can objectify us, make us feel seen, judged.
And potentially limited in our freedom.
I see how this connects to No Exit.
Yes.
Those characters are trapped constantly under each other's gaze, unable to escape that judgment.
Precisely.
And Sartre illustrates this with an anecdote from his own life.
Oh, right.
As a young student, he requested to sit at the back of the classroom to avoid being watched.
To escape that feeling of being objectified.
So even something as simple as choosing where to sit can be tied to these ideas about freedom,
yes.
Self-consciousness, the power of the other.
It's all connected.
And the look isn't just about being self-conscious, is it?
No.
It's about those power dynamics in relationships.
Right.
The way we look at each other can be a way of asserting dominance, control, even violence.
It's a complex dynamic.
So it's this constant negotiation between our own freedom and the ways we're perceived by others.
And potentially constrained by others.
Precisely. And this brings us to another key concept, the project.
Yes. Sartre argues that each of us chooses a path in life, a project that gives meaning to our existence.
It's not something predetermined, it's something we're free to choose.
And that freedom comes with responsibility.
So it's not just about finding our purpose, but about actively creating it through our choices.
Exactly. And this is where Sartre departs from traditional Freudian psychoanalysis.
Okay, how so?
He proposes what he calls an existential psychoanalysis.
That focuses on understanding the individual's unique choices.
And the meaning they create for themselves.
So it's less about digging into the past and more about how our present choices shape who we are becoming.
Exactly.
And this emphasis on freedom and responsibility leads us to that complex relationship between Sartre and Marxism.
It does. It's where things get really interesting.
This is where I feel like things get really tricky.
It's definitely a journey with twists and turns, moments of both embrace and critique.
Sartre's engagement with Marxism was a lifelong process, wasn't it?
It was.
Trying to reconcile his belief in individual freedom with those historical and social forces that shape our lives.
Absolutely.
So how did this tricky relationship with Marxism actually play out?
It's a fascinating journey, full of twists and turns, moments of both embrace and critique.
Where do we see those moments you mentioned?
Well, his early encounters with Marxism were a real mixed bag.
Okay.
He admitted that initially he really struggled to grasp its relevance, but as he dug deeper, he started to see how it could shed light on those social structures.
And power dynamics.
Exactly.
It sounds like that classic case of, I don't agree with everything you say, but I see where you're coming from.
Exactly. He was drawn to the idea of creating a more just and equitable society.
But he also felt the need to reconcile that with his emphasis on individual freedom and responsibility.
Absolutely. That tension is always there.
This constant push and pull between the individual and the collective, it seems to run through all of his work.
It's a central theme for him, and it's what led him to develop this concept of the engaged intellectual.
Okay, what's that all about?
He believed that thinkers shouldn't just stay in their ivory towers, They should actively participate in political affairs, use their knowledge and skills to make a real difference.
I can see how that would resonate with him, especially given his experiences with the war and his growing interest in Marxism.
It wasn't enough to just theorize about the world. He felt compelled to act.
To engage with those issues of his time.
Exactly.
And he put this idea into practice through his involvement with that journal, L'État Moderne, right?
Yes, it became a platform for intellectuals to engage in those critical discussions about politics, culture, society.
He also explored those themes in his literary works, like the play Dirty Hands, which delves into the moral complexities of political action.
It's interesting how he was able to weave those philosophical and political threads into his writing.
Making them accessible to a wider audience, but the sources also mention he was criticized for being too individualistic.
Oh, yeah.
How did he respond to that?
Well, one of his most famous works, Existentialism is a Humanism, was actually a direct response to those criticisms.
People accused his philosophy of promoting despair and isolation.
And he countered that by arguing that existentialism is fundamentally about human connection.
Okay, but how does he make that leap, from that individual anguish we see in Nausea to this idea of responsibility for all of humanity?
Well, in Existentialism is a Humanism, he introduces the concept of co-responsibility.
All right, what's that all about?
It's the idea that our choices have consequences, not just for ourselves, but for everyone else.
Okay.
When we make a choice, we're not just choosing for ourselves. We're also, in a sense, choosing for humanity.
It's a powerful idea, but also a heavy burden. Like, he's saying we're all connected, whether we like it or not.
And that we can't escape those consequences of our choices.
Exactly.
And this shift in his thinking really reflects his growing engagement with political activism.
And his deeper understanding of Marxism.
But it wasn't a simple embrace of Marxist doctrine.
No.
In fact, he was quite critical of what he called lazy Marxism.
Lazy Marxism. Okay, I'm intrigued. What did he mean by that?
Well, he felt that many Marxists were too focused on historical determinism.
So the idea that history unfolds according to a predetermined plan?
Exactly, that it's all about economic forces driving change.
He argued that this ignored the role of individual freedom and choice.
Absolutely. He felt it reduced people to cogs in a historical machine, stripping them of their agency.
So it wasn't Marxism itself he rejected,
No.
but a particular interpretation of it that he felt was too rigid.
Too deterministic. He was calling for a more dynamic and humanistic approach.
One that recognized the power of individuals to shape history, even within those constraints.
Exactly.
This reminds me of that quote by Margaret Mead. "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has."
It's a great quote.
It's like both Sartre and Mead are saying we can't just sit back and wait for history to happen.
We have to actively participate in shaping it.
And Sartre's critique of lazy Marxism is also reflected in his emphasis on personal experience.
Right. He criticized Marxists for neglecting the formative experiences of childhood.
Okay.
Focusing solely on that adult experience of alienation in the workplace.
So it's not just about economic conditions, it's about that whole web of experiences that shape our understanding of the world.
Precise.
And all of these critiques and reflections ultimately led Sartre to attempt a grand synthesis, a way to bring together his existentialist framework with a more nuanced understanding of Marxism.
And that's where his major work, Critique of Dialectical Reason, comes in.
The sources mention it as his most ambitious and challenging work.
It's certainly a dense read.
Yeah.
But it's also incredibly rewarding.
Okay, I'm ready to take on the challenge.
All right.
Where do we start? What are some of the key concepts he introduces in Critique of Dialectical Reason?
Well, he begins by exploring these concepts of scarcity and seriality.
Okay, break it down for me.
Scarcity refers to that fundamental condition of human existence.
The fact that we live in a world of limited resources.
Exactly. And this scarcity, he argues, creates competition, conflict.
It makes me think of those nature documentaries where animals are always fighting over territory and resources.
He's not saying it's just a biological instinct, though.
Okay.
It's that the condition of scarcity shapes our social and economic structures, which leads to certain patterns of behavior. And this connects to his concept of seriality.
So what is seriality all about?
It describes that alienated state of individuals living in a capitalist society.
Okay.
They're treated as interchangeable units, cogs in a machine, rather than unique persons.
Think about standing in line at the grocery store or commuting on a crowded train.
You're surrounded by people, but you're also isolated, anonymous, reduced to your function as a consumer.
I can definitely relate to that feeling.
It's like being surrounded by people, yet feeling utterly alone.
And Sartre argues that this seriality prevents us from recognizing our shared humanity.
From forming those meaningful connections, and from acting collectively to change the world.
So it's not just about feeling lonely, it's about losing our sense of agency, our ability to act together.
Exactly. But Sartre doesn't leave us in a state of despair.
Oh.
He offers a glimmer of hope through his concept of the group infusion.
What's that all about?
It's a moment when individuals overcome their isolation and join together in a common project.
They recognize their shared humanity, their collective power.
It's a powerful antidote to that seriality.
Do you have an example of what a group infusion might look like in real life?
He uses a simple example.
Yeah.
People waiting for a bus. Initially, they're just individuals, each absorbed in their own thoughts, existing in that seriality.
Right.
But if the bus breaks down or something unexpected happens, they might start talking to each other.
Sharing their frustrations, maybe even working together to find a solution.
Exactly.
So it's a shared experience, maybe even a hardship that can create that sense of solidarity.
A moment of connection that breaks through those barriers.
And this leads to the possibility of collective action, of people coming together to challenge the status quo.
To create a more just and equitable world.
It makes me think of those moments in history where people have spontaneously come together to demand change.
Like during the Civil Rights Movement or the Arab Spring.
Great examples. And while Sartre sees the group infusion as a powerful force,
he also warns against its potential dangers.
Oh, how so?
When a group solidifies its unity through oaths, pledges, rigid structures,
it risks becoming a pledged group, which can suppress individual freedom.
And stifle dissent.
So it's like a double-edged sword. Collective action can be liberating.
But it can also lead to new forms of oppression.
If it's not balanced with individual freedom and critical thinking.
That's a key insight, and this tension between individual freedom and collective action is further explored in his controversial views on violence.
This is where I imagine he faced a lot of criticism.
He did. It's a complex issue, and Sartre argued that violence can sometimes be necessary.
Necessary for what?
For overcoming oppression and achieving liberation. He saw it as a way for the oppressed to reclaim their agency.
To fight against injustice.
But of course that raises the question,
Right. Wouldn't that justify any act of violence as long as the person believes they're fighting for a just cause?
That's where the debate gets really tricky, and Sartre himself acknowledged those ethical dilemmas.
He wasn't advocating for a simple glorification of violence.
No, he was trying to grapple with its complex role in historical struggles.
So it's not a black and white issue for him.
Not at all.
It's about carefully weighing the potential consequences in each specific situation.
And his views on violence were fiercely debated.
I can imagine.
Raymond Aron, a contemporary philosopher, was particularly critical of Sartre, arguing that revolutionary violence often leads to more suffering.
More oppression.
It's a debate that continues today as we grapple with those complexities of social change movements.
The ethical dilemmas of using violence to achieve political goals, but moving on from that contentious topic,
Right.
let's talk about Sartre's own political engagements, particularly his involvement in the events of May 1968.
May 1968, a pivotal moment in French history.
A fascinating case study in the dynamics of social movements and the role of intellectuals.
To fully understand Sartre's involvement, we need to rewind a few years to his decision to decline the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1964.
That's right. He famously refused the award.
He did.
I've always been curious about his reasons.
Well, he had both personal and political motivations.
Okay.
On a personal level, he was always uncomfortable with those official honors and awards.
He saw them as a way of being co-opted by the establishment.
Of losing his independence.
So it was partly about maintaining his integrity as an outsider, a critic of the status quo.
Exactly. But there were also those political reasons.
Like what?
He argued that the Nobel Prize was biased towards Western writers.
Overlooking important voices from the Third World.
He saw it as a reflection of Western cultural hegemony, a way of reinforcing those existing power structures.
It was a bold statement, and it solidified his image as a rebel, someone who refused to play by the rules.
And this image became even more powerful during the events of May 1968.
When student protests and strikes swept across France, challenging the government.
Demanding social change?
I can see how his earlier decisions, like refusing the Nobel Prize, would have made him a natural ally of the student movement.
He was seen as a symbol of resistance.
But how did he actually engage with the protests?
He saw the student movement as an embodiment of that new intellectual he'd been advocating for.
Someone who's directly engaged with the masses, using their knowledge and skills to support those movements.
To challenge injustice, he participated in debates, gave lectures, wrote articles.
Amplifying their voices, helping to shape the intellectual discourse around the protests.
It was putting those ideas into action, showing that intellectual engagement isn't just about writing.
It's about being present, being involved, and using your platform to support those who are fighting for a better world.
Exactly. And he was particularly interested in the shifting understanding of that revolutionary subject.
Okay.
Traditional Marxism had focused on the industrial proletariat as the agent of change.
Right, but the protests of May 1968 involved a much broader range of participants.
Exactly. Students, women, intellectuals, and other groups that had traditionally been marginalized or excluded.
So he saw this as a more inclusive and dynamic vision of social change.
Absolutely.
Recognizing that revolutionary potential exists in many different groups and across those social strata.
Exactly. And he saw this as a positive development, a sign that those traditional boundaries of class and identity were breaking down.
Creating new possibilities for collective action and social transformation.
And these events, along with his ongoing engagement with Marxism and his own evolving understanding of existentialism, they shaped his final reflections.
His final reflections on the nature of revolution and the meaning of human existence.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about those final reflections.
Right.
What were the key themes that emerged in his later work?
One of the most striking things is his emphasis on the moral dimension of revolutionary action.
He argued that it's driven not just by material needs, but by a profound sense of injustice.
A desire for freedom.
So it's not just about economics, it's about a deeper moral imperative.
A yearning for a more just and humane world.
He famously said, "You can't set the masses in motion over matters of fact." It isn't, for example, simply the fact that wages are too low that mobilizes them, but the fact that they deeply feel the injustice that is done to them.
It's about tapping into that deep well of moral outrage, that feeling that things are fundamentally wrong and need to change.
And this led him to critique that traditional Marxist goal of simply changing the mode of production.
Replacing capitalism with socialism.
He argued that revolution should aim at something more profound.
A transformation of human relationships. the creation of a more just and fulfilling society.
So it's not just about changing the economic system, it's about changing the way we relate to each other.
Creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to live a meaningful and authentic life.
And this vision of a more just and fulfilling society is reflected in his late conversations with Pierre Victor and Philippe Gavi, published as Hope Now, the 1980 interviews.
Those conversations offer a fascinating glimpse into his evolving thinking.
Those late works are always so intriguing, you know, those moments when a thinker looks back on their life.
Tries to make sense of it all.
What are some of the key insights that emerge from those conversations?
He continues to emphasize the importance of individual freedom.
And responsibility, even within the context of collective action.
He stresses the need for a more nuanced and flexible understanding of Marxism.
One that recognizes the complexities of human experience and the limits of any predetermined plan.
So it's about holding on to that tension, constantly striving to find a balance.
While also acknowledging that there are no easy answers, no fixed formulas for creating a better world.
Precisely. And his final reflections are a testament to his enduring belief in the power of human agency to shape history.
To create a more just and fulfilling future.
Absolutely.
Wow. This has been quite a journey.
It has.
We've covered so much, from Sartre's, first steps in philosophy to his final thoughts on revolution and the meaning of life.
It's a lot to process.
It is, but I feel like I'm starting to grasp the depth and complexity of his thought.
He's not an easy thinker to pin down.
No, not at all.
But that's part of what makes him so compelling.
It's like he's offering us a toolkit, for navigating the complexities of human existence.
Even if we don't always agree with his conclusions.
Right. He forces us to confront those uncomfortable truths about our freedom.
And the consequences of our choices.
And I think one of the most important takeaways is that this freedom,
this responsibility,
it's not just an individual burden.
It's something we share collectively.
Right. It connects back to that idea of co-responsibility you mentioned earlier.
We're all in this together. And our actions have consequences that ripple outwards,
impacting the lives of others.
And that's why his work is so relevant to the challenges we face today.
Okay, how so?
Political polarization, climate change, the rise of AI.
These are all issues that demand a sense of shared responsibility.
A willingness to think beyond our individual needs.
To consider the well-being of the planet, future generations.
It's like he's giving us a framework for thinking about these global issues.
For understanding how our individual choices are intertwined with those larger social and political structures.
And even if we don't always agree with his specific prescriptions, he challenges us to ask those tough questions.
To grapple with those ethical dilemmas.
To take responsibility for the world we're creating.
That's a powerful legacy, isn't it?
It is.
To leave behind a body of work that continues to provoke and inspire.
Generations of thinkers and activists.
It's a hallmark of a truly great thinker. Someone who can challenge us, provoke us, and inspire us.
To think more deeply about the world and our place in it.
Well said. So for our listeners who are fired up to explore Sartre's ideas further, what would you recommend as a next step? Where should they dive in?
Well, given our conversation today, I think exploring critique of dialectical reason would be a fascinating next step.
Okay.
It's a challenging work, but it offers a profound exploration of that relationship between individual freedom and historical forces.
Between existentialism and Marxism.
It's a book that demands careful reading and critical engagement, but it's also incredibly rewarding.
I love that suggestion.
It's like the culmination of so many of the themes we've discussed today.
It would be a great way for our listeners to continue the journey.
I encourage them to approach it with an open mind, ready to be challenged, provoked, and perhaps even transformed.
By Sartre's powerful and enduring ideas.
Exactly.
Well, that's a perfect note to end on. A huge thank you to our expert for guiding us through this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Into the life and work of Jean-Paul Sartre. You've given us a lot to think about.
I hope so.
I know I'll be revisiting these ideas for a long time to come.
Me too.
And to our listeners, keep those minds curious and those questions coming.
We'll see you next time.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a fascinating topic. Until then, happy exploring.